On February 26, 1959, a search party found a tent on the eastern slope of a mountain in the northern Ural Mountains. The mountain's name, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people, translates to Dead Mountain. The tent had been cut open from the inside. 9 sets of footprints led away from it, into the snow, in negative 30-degree temperatures. Some of the prints were barefoot. They followed the footprints for 1.5 kilometers. They found the first 2 bodies under a cedar tree, in their underwear, next to a fire that had burned out. Over the next 3 months, they found the rest. 1 had a crushed skull with no external wound. 1 had a chest compressed with the force of a car crash, but no bruising on the skin. 1 was missing her tongue. The Soviet government classified the case for 30 years. The official cause of death was listed as, and I'm quoting, a compelling natural force. No one has ever explained what that force was.
Welcome back to the Eerie Stories podcast. I'm Seraphina Vale.
And I'm Elias Thorne.
Tonight, the Dyatlov Pass incident. 9 hikers, dead mountain. And a question that's been unanswered for 66 years. What made them run?
January 23rd, 1959. A group of 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute board a train in Sverdlovsk, the city we now call Yekaterinburg. They're heading north into the Ural Mountains for a Category 3 ski expedition. Category 3 is the highest difficulty rating the Soviet system offered.
These weren't amateurs. Every one of them had years of backcountry experience. They knew what the mountains could do.
The group leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, radio engineering student, serious, methodical, experienced. He designed the route himself, a 300-kilometer traverse through some of the most remote terrain in the Soviet Union. The destination was Mount Thorne, about 10 kilometers north of the site where they'd eventually die. The group included Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, who Dyatlov was in love with; Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, the youngest, an economics student who'd already completed multiple difficult expeditions; Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, the oldest, a World War II veteran and sports instructor who joined the group at the last minute.
And then there was Yuri Krivonishchenko, 23, an engineering graduate who'd spent time working at Chelyabinsk 40.
That's important. We'll come back to that.
Chelyabinsk 40 was the Soviet Union's plutonium production facility. It's where the Kyshtym nuclear disaster happened in 1957, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, 2 years before this trip.
On January 28th, 5 days into the trek, 1 member turned back. Yuri Yudin. He had joint pain and couldn't continue. He hugged his friends goodbye at the edge of the wilderness. He was the last person to see any of them alive.
He later said, "If I could ask them one question, it would be, what made you go up the mountain that night?"
The remaining 9 continued north. By January 31st, the group had reached the highland area at the edge of the tree line. They cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley, supplies for the return trip. On February 1st, they began their push toward the pass.
And this is where the first mistake happens. Or what looks like a mistake.
A snowstorm hit. Visibility dropped to near zero. They lost their orientation and drifted west, toward the slope of Kolatsiakal instead of through the pass. When they realized where they were, they had a choice. They could retreat downhill into the forest and lose the altitude they'd gained, or they could camp where they were, on the exposed slope, and push through the pass in the morning.
They chose to camp.
And I want to say something about that. This wasn't reckless. These were experienced mountaineers making a tactical decision. Retreating downhill in a whiteout is dangerous. Setting up camp and waiting for better visibility is standard practice.
But they set up camp on a mountain called Dead Mountain.
Yes, they did. The tent was set up at approximately 5 p.m. on a shallow depression on the eastern slope. They ate dinner. They wrote in their journals. Their last diary entries are ordinary. Plans for the next day. Observations about the weather. One of them made a joke about a newspaper they'd been writing for fun during the trip.
And then, sometime that night, something happened.
They cut their way out. Not through the tent flap. They slashed the canvas from the inside. Multiple cuts, made with knives, from the inside out. Whatever was happening, the tent entrance wasn't fast enough.
9 people in negative 30 degrees. Some in their underwear, some barefoot, some with one shoe. Climbed out through the slashed canvas and walked away from the only thing that could keep them alive.
And they didn't run. Not at first. The footprint analysis showed they walked in an orderly column downhill toward the forest. 9 sets of tracks, side by side.
Walking into certain death, in formation, as if whatever was behind them was worse.
The search began on February 20th, after the group failed to check in at Vijay. On February 26th, they found the tent. The next day, they followed the footprints downhill and found the first 2 bodies. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, and Yuri Krivonischenko, 23, under a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest, 1.5 kilometers from the tent. They were in their underwear. A small fire had been built next to the tree. It had burned out. Their hands were torn and bloody. Branches of the cedar were broken off up to 5 meters high.
They climbed the tree.
They climbed the tree. In the dark, in their underwear, in negative 30 degrees, they climbed a cedar tree and broke off branches. Why?
To see the tent. Or to see something else.
Over the next week, 3 more bodies were found between the tent and the cedar along the line of footprints. Igor Dyatlov, face down in the snow, one arm raised as if he'd been crawling back toward the tent. 300 meters away, Zinaida Kolmogorova, 480 meters from the tent, and Rustam Slobodin, 630 meters out. Slobodin had a small fracture in his skull.
All 5 of these, the 2 under the cedar, the 3 along the ridge, died of hypothermia. They froze to death. The medical examiner found no other significant injuries. The story, so far as terrible as it is, could be explained by exposure, by panic, by a catastrophic decision to leave the tent. But then they found the last 4.
May 4th, 1959. 3 months after the incident. Searchers found a makeshift den in a ravine, 75 meters from the cedar tree, under 4 meters of snow. A creek was running beneath them. 4 bodies. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault Brignol.
They were wearing clothing that had been taken from Doroshenko and Krivonischenko, the 2 who died first under the cedar. They had stripped clothes from their dead friends to try to survive.
Kolevatov died of hypothermia. The other 3 did not. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23. His temporal bone, the bone at the side of the skull, was crushed inward. A massive, depressed skull fracture. Fatal. But there was no external wound, no bruising on the skin, no impact mark. The bone was crushed without breaking the skin.
Semyon Zolotaryov, 38. 5 broken ribs, open wound on his skull, missing both eyes. He had a camera around his neck. The film was damaged by water.
And then there was Dubinina. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old. 6 or more broken ribs on both sides of her chest, causing flailed chest and massive internal hemorrhaging. The medical examiner, Dr. Vozrojdeny, said the force required to cause these injuries was equivalent to a car crash. But there was no external bruising, no impact marks, as if a force had compressed her chest from all directions at once.
And she was missing her tongue. Not cut. Torn out at the root. Missing her eyes. Missing part of her lips.
Dr. Vozrojdeny wrote in his report that no human could have inflicted these injuries. The force required was too great.
So what did?
The investigation recovered several cameras from the group. Most of the photographs are what you'd expect from a hiking trip. Friends posing, landscapes, camp setup, but the last frame on Yuri Krivonischenko's camera, frame 34, shows something else.
It's blurry, overexposed. It appears to show a bright light or glowing orb against a dark sky. It was taken at the campsite sometime before or during the incident.
Now, I need to be responsible about this. The image is blurry enough that it could be a camera malfunction, a light leak, an accidental exposure, but here's what makes it difficult to dismiss.
Other people saw lights that night.
A group of hikers 50 kilometers south of Kholat Syakhl reported seeing a bright object moving across the sky in the direction of Dead Mountain on the night of February 1st. Military personnel at a base in the region logged similar sightings. A meteorological station recorded unexplained light phenomena.
And then there's the radiation.
When the last 4 bodies were examined, the clothing of Krivonischenko and Dubinina tested positive for significant beta radiation contamination, 2 to 3 times above normal levels.
Krivonischenko had worked at Chelyabinsk 40, the Mayak nuclear facility. The standard explanation is that his clothing was contaminated from his previous work there.
That's possible, but beta radiation from workplace contamination degrades over time. He'd left Chelyabinsk 40 well before the expedition, and Dubinina's clothing was also contaminated, and she had no connection to any nuclear facility.
She was wearing his clothes. She'd taken them from his body at the Cedar.
That explains her clothing, but it doesn't explain why his clothing was still significantly radioactive months or years after he left the facility, unless there was a more recent source.
The Soviet government classified the case almost immediately after the radiation findings. The case files were sealed for 30 years. When they were declassified in the late 1980s, several pages were missing.
I want to walk through the theories because people have spent decades on this. Theory 1. Avalanche. This is the conclusion of the 2020 Russian government reinvestigation. A slab avalanche, a dense layer of snow sliding over a weaker layer, could explain the sudden tent evacuation and potentially the crushing injuries. A 2021 study from EPFL and ETH Zurich demonstrated that the slope angle and snow conditions could produce a small slab avalanche.
Problems with this theory.
Several. No avalanche debris was found at the tent site. The tent was partially collapsed but not buried. The footprints leading away were on undisturbed snow. If an avalanche had passed through, the footprints wouldn't exist. Slab avalanches don't produce radiation, and the specific injuries, a skull crushed without skin damage, a tongue torn out, are not consistent with avalanche trauma.
Theory 2. Military testing. The Soviet Union was conducting missile tests in the region. Parachute mines, rockets. The lights in the sky could have been descending ordnance. This explains the government cover-up, potentially the radiation, potentially the injuries if the group was caught near an impact zone.
But it doesn't explain why the military wouldn't simply retrieve the bodies and stage a different scenario. The Soviet government had the power to make 9 hikers disappear entirely. Instead, they allowed a search, an investigation, and an autopsy, and then classified it. That's not how you cover up a military accident. That's how you cover up something you can't explain.
Theory 3 is mine, and Elias is going to hate it.
I'm ready.
Something on that mountain. Something they saw or something that found them was so far outside their understanding that 9 rational, experienced people chose to flee into certain death rather than remain in its presence. The tent wasn't cut because of an avalanche. The tent was cut because the entrance was on the wrong side.
You're saying something was at the tent entrance?
I'm saying they cut the opposite wall. And I'm saying the Mansi people didn't name that mountain Dead Mountain because of the weather.
I don't have data to counter that. I have data that says the avalanche theory is incomplete. I have data that says the military theory doesn't fit the cover-up pattern. and I have an image on frame 34 that I can't identify.
And you have 9 people who knew, who absolutely knew, that leaving their tent meant death, and they left anyway. Every single one of them at the same time.
Yeah.
There's one more person in this story. The 10th hiker. The one who survived because he got sick.
Yuri Yudin, 21 years old at the time of the incident. He turned back on January 28th because of joint pain. He hugged his friends goodbye at the edge of the wilderness. For the next 54 years, he tried to understand what happened to them.
He identified their belongings when the bodies were recovered. He recognized the clothing they'd stripped from each other. He became a vocal advocate for reopening the investigation. He gave interviews. He wrote letters. He revisited the past.
He never got an answer.
He died on April 27th, 2013. He was 75. He asked to be buried with his friends at the Mikhailovsko Cemetery in Yekaterinburg. He was.
The pass where they died is named after Igor Dyatlov. The mountain is still called Dead Mountain, and the official cause of death is still listed as a compelling natural force.
A compelling natural force.
Whatever that means.
I think they knew what it meant. I think they saw it. And I think the only photograph of it is frame 34, on a water-damaged roll of film from a dead man's camera.
That one's heavy.
Yeah.
If you're out there hiking, if you're in the mountains tonight, stay together.
And if the mountain has a name that warns you, listen to the name. If the Eerie Stories podcast has become part of your routine, subscribe. It helps others find these stories.
We'll see you next time.
Stay close to the light.